You will find free will offering baskets out there, which help support the Western Dominican province. We just received 9 novices this year, which is the most we've had in a number of years. So, of course, we pay for all the stuff ourselves. Also, if you wish to make a check out, make it out to the parish, and they'll give me an exchange or whatever they do at the end of the mission. The last thing is that after the conference, I will greet you briefly, and then I will be hearing confessions. So that's the normal confessional. Sunday, I told you that I wanted to talk to you about the law. And one of the reasons is because law is something that is very misunderstood in our present society, as is obedience. Many people think that obedience and love are inimical to each other, when as a matter of fact, they're both about the same thing, because they both involve a union of wills of one person to another, which is expressed in some kind of command and intelligence. For many centuries, many people looked upon the law and obedience as primarily a competition of wills. They didn't bring the intelligence into it at all. In fact, I knew a sister who died last year at 94. She was my teacher training teacher in Los Angeles. And she told this story that when she was a young nun in the 30s, she made a mistake. And in those days, they used to prostrate themselves in front of the door to the dining room, you know, the refectory, and all the nuns would walk over them when they made a mistake. Well, she did this, and the last person in line was the novice mistress, who had not been present when whatever was done was done. So she said, "Brigitte Claire, what did you do?" And so Sister said, "Well, Mother, I just thought," she says, wait a minute, that was your first big mistake, thinking. There's to be no thinking in this convent." You know? And of course you want to say, how can we help it? God gave us intelligence for a reason. Instead, the law and conscience and authority and all those things involves intelligence. It involves understanding. And as a result, law, there's a famous definition for it, which is found in Thomas Aquinas. An ordinance of reason made for the common good by the competent authority and promulgated, which means it has to be officially presented to the notice of the people you expect to obey. If you've seen the old movie, The 10 Commandments, you remember that whenever the Pharaoh makes a decree, he says, "So let it be written, so let it be done." Well, this definition, though it's made basically for our civil laws here that we experience in everything, actually has a very elastic interpretation connected to it, because it's applied actually to 4 kinds of law. According to our catechism, there are 4 kinds of law. The first is the ordinance of reason that's in God's mind, in the Word, when he creates the world, the whole world. Everything is subject to God's ordering. We call this the eternal law. And according to John Paul II's encyclical, Splendor of Truth, and also all the things that came after it or before it, eternal law is the primary source of all law. And as I told you, it does involve intelligence, because what makes a rock different from a tree, different from a rose, is present in God's mind when he creates the world. That's why we say in the Word, you know, God, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him was nothing made that has been made. So when God reflects upon himself in the eternal Word, he also makes a part of that his creation of the world. Now, human beings have the glory among all the rest of material creation of being able to understand this Word as far as they're concerned. This is seen in the garden, in Adam and Eve, in their temptation. Because remember, the animals are all brought to Adam to be named, and he names them instantaneously on experiencing them, which shows he has intelligence. Also, God gave us the glory of participating in realizing our own destiny according to freedom and the truth when he placed man in the garden, and this is before the creation of Eve, although she shares in it when she's created, and gives him, though he has all these wonderful gifts, he doesn't suffer from emotional weakness, he doesn't suffer from death, he doesn't suffer from ignorance, he doesn't suffer from manipulation. Instead, he almost is in a continuous state of infused contemplation, but it was all the result of grace. He is in one tiny commandment to demonstrate that he's not responsible for this, that this is a work of grace. And it's described in Genesis as you may not eat of the fruit of a tree, but it could be any small infraction of God's will for the universe. And remember, the tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There was a long discussion in one theological book many years ago about whether that meant that Adam had freedom, because obviously if he know the difference between good and evil, he couldn't make a choice. And Thomas Aquinas says, yes, he knew the difference intellectually, but in Scripture you tend to be said to know something when you experience it. But he hadn't yet experienced the difference. He only experienced good. And when Eve is created, remember, and he recognizes her, they both experience only good. And that's what's seen in the famous verse in Genesis, which John Paul II makes a great deal of, where it said they're naked and not ashamed. In other words, their bodies, they look on a communion of spousal love, of giving themselves one to another, and not from manipulation for their ego. But of course, that all depends on grace and obedience. As soon as Adam disobeys and Eve disobeys, they lose grace. And when they lose grace, all the things we suffer from enter. Remember, the punishment your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Well, there is an order between man and woman, but it's wise government of free citizen. The fact that it's perverted into master for slave is a result of sin. And women, of course, have their power share because they do it by tricking the man. Why didn't you tell me that? You didn't ask me. So, in other words, they both begin to look on their bodies as means of mutual manipulation. And then, of course, the first brothers, well, what happens with them? Do they get along? I remember when Pope Benedict became Pope, they said to him, are you going to have fraternal authority now like brothers and not have monarchical papacy anymore? And Pope Benedict said, just remember what the first two brothers did to each other. Right? I mean, one killed the other. And it goes down through the human race till it reaches Babel, where our various language, which should be a sign of our reasonability, becomes a sign of our inability to understand others and our attempt to rival God. But the eternal law is the source of the truth of everything that exists ethically. We share in that when we come to understand what our actions are about and how they fulfill what we were created to be. And that is called the natural law. It's called the natural law because it can be arrived at through reason. Now, today, for many centuries, people could know some of the natural law, but they didn't know it all. And the reason is because we inherited ignorance with the original sin. So there are two principal punishments for the original sin. There's ignorance in the mind, and then that's expressed in unbridled egotism, malice in the will. God, remember, promised in Genesis a Redeemer. And so there are two basic stages that supplement the natural law of our preparation for the Redeemer. Now, in between that is the laws we make for ourselves, civil law, the law we make in Congress or the monarch makes or whoever in our civil societies. But notice, since the source of all law is God's objective truth that we understand objectively, it doesn't matter how powerful an authority is in a country, a nation, a state. If they make a law which contradicts the natural law, it's not real. It's a usurpation of law. And it cannot bind us in the conscience. In fact, it binds us not to obey it in our conscience, actually. So, the civil law is important for us experiencing justice as a group, because you can't have a group act together unless you have someone with authority to make the law and them to obey it. Even let's say you have 6 men who go down to row a boat. So they're told, well, just row as you feel. Well, all the oars would conflict with each other. This one want to go this way, this one this way, this one this way. And they go around in circles and they wouldn't go anywhere. So they establish one person, the authority, to call the time and say, this is where we're going, and this is the time. And then when they row according to the time, then they actually get there. So authority doesn't exist for its own right. It exists to serve the community. And in ancient times, they discussed what was the ideal form of government in civil matters, and they came up with various solutions. So Plato hated democracy because, of course, it killed the only wise man he ever knew in Athens, Socrates. But Aristotle, who was a little more objective, said actually the ideal government should include all 3 of the possible kinds, which would be democracy, oligarchy, which is aristocracy, or in our case, it would be like the Senate, and then you have the monarch. But notice they all share in power. Today, C.S. Lewis said once that today people are kept tyrannized by Satan because it's suggested to them that any desire for virtue is undemocratic. And he says democracy is the word by which you have to lead the people by the nose. And he said, never let them ask what it means, because democracy is good, it's a system of government. But when it becomes a system of being, where we determine the truth by our vote, that's where we get into trouble. So my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. There is no objectivity in truth. And, I have my truth, I live, and my truth tells me that though I'm born a man, I should be a woman. Well, that's good for me. And if you have the opposite, that's good for you. And there is no objective good. And then pretty soon it becomes the tyranny of the majority. If the majority says we should kill children in the womb, then that makes it right. The trouble is, of course, the majority can change its mind tomorrow and say it's murder to kill children. Which is it? So, civil law is important for this world and for our relationships with each other, because we have to have some authority and some rule according to reason, in order to experience objective justice. Now, in addition to this, it wouldn't matter if your government was a democracy, an oligarchy, or a monarchy, or a combination of all three, as to whether it's a tyranny or a just government. What makes the difference between the two? According to Plato, it's whether the government's interested in the common good, which is objective of all the citizens, or it's only interested in its private self-interest, its private good. If a government exists to perfect, or aggrandize or benefit only one group of the citizens, even if they're a majority of one, then it's a tyranny. It has to be selfless. It has to be oriented toward what we as a whole society need. So, because we have this experience in civil society, and because we also have ignorance in our minds and malice in our wills, at a certain point in time, God chose to intervene, and he gave us the law, the law. The word we use often for the law when it comes to Scripture is testament. The law has two basic movements, the law of God, the divine law. One is the Old Testament, which perfects the hand but not the heart. And the other is the New Testament, which, because it's the presence of the Holy Spirit in your hearts, also has to perfect the heart in addition to the hand. Remember, the Lord was constantly criticized for breaking the literal letter of the law in certain cases, especially ceremonial laws like the Sabbath. But the law was, the Lord was trying to show us that the primary nature of the law is for us to form ourselves internally to live the same life that God lives and thus participate in the eternal law. Now, in our catechism, and it's traditionally taught, and it's probably origin is St. Thomas Aquinas, there are three kinds of law in the Old Testament. We call these the two tablets. They're based on the two tablets. Remember, Moses had two tablets? Okay. The first table of the law has to do with the first three commandments. And these respect, as I'm going to show you tomorrow night, the proper love and worship of God. The commandments in the first table of the law are more about figurative things than about literal things. So when it comes to an issue like the Sabbath rest, Christ was condemned by the Pharisees for not resting on violating the Sabbath rest by healing people. This is a wrong understanding of what the first three commandments are about. And if you go to Israel today, they're still fighting over the literal sense of the first three commandments. So they'll have laws like on the Sabbath, you're allowed to travel on a bus for 2 miles. Or I think you can use one elevator but not another one. And they get so bogged down in all these, that's where the Jewish people make us great lawyers. They get so bogged down in all these minutiae that they forget the real purpose of the law. And so Christ, remember, in this case says, well, which of you wouldn't take your ox out or ass out of a well if it fell down it during the Sabbath? If you can be so kind to your animals, what if I want to heal this person on the Sabbath? How is that a violation of the Sabbath law? It's not. It's affirming it. The second table comprises the last 7 commandments. And this has to do with our neighbor. Now, this is more literal than figurative. So you can see there's a difference between how the two kinds of commandments bind and are interpreted. The literal commandments are not in the first table. They're more figurative because what they're trying to institute in us is the virtue of religion. In other words, the proper worship of God, where we in justice recognize that God is someone we're trying to repay that we can never repay, in things like sacrifices. So in that sense, the literal interpretation, a figurative interpretation, can be sacrificed to the literal interpretation if the need arises. The second is just the opposite. And you can see this in the prophets. People like Amos. I'm sick of your sacrifices. All you do is put sacrifices there, but you misuse and abuse the people you live with. You know, the people go to the market and you put your hand on the scale so they'll be cheated. What kind of sacrifice is this? How does this apply to the whole thing? So this has to do with the just relationship between our neighbor. And as I'm going to show you, there are all kinds of material sins. Also, most of those commandments, not the fourth, but most of them are negative commandments. Thou shalt not. Positive commandments don't bind under every circumstance. Things like honoring your father and your mother, because you're not always with your father and your mother. But negative commands bind under every circumstance. Murder is murder. Abortion is abortion, whether someone feels they need it or not. I know all kinds of people, even Catholics, who say, well, I'm personally against abortion, but my 16-year-old daughter is pregnant, so she needs to get one, so there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a very good Catholic anyway. No, you can't be that way. The same is true with theft. Theft is a theft no matter who does it, where it's done, whether it's done by people breaking into a store and looting it, or by the head of a business who refuses to pay a just wage. That's theft. It doesn't matter the guy is rich and he has all kinds of money, because he owes that to his workers in justice. The same is true with lying. A lie is speaking contrary to the truth with the intent to deceive to someone who has no right to know the truth. So I remember I was presented with a moral dilemma in Nazi Germany, when they used to execute Jews. Many Catholics hid the Jews, or they falsified their baptism on baptismal records. So one of the fellows who was a little, I think, too rigorous, because morals isn't an easy area, he said, well, they shouldn't have done that. They should have submitted to death rather than falsify, because that's still a lie. I said, no, the Nazis didn't have a right to know who was baptized and who wasn't. That's a matter for the church. So not telling them the truth is lying to them, because they don't have a right. It's not a matter of injustice, because they don't have a right and justice to know the truth. Laws are based on rights. And to give another his due, which is how we define justice, a due is a right. If you don't have a right, people can't be violating it. So for us to understand what was involved in our preparation, because remember, the law was given, it says to the community, that in this case, the rector, the authority in Israel was God. This was seen in the fact that, remember, when they first began to be a people, they were ruled by judges. And then, of course, they eventually said, well, we want to be like everybody else. We want a king. And I love that famous parable where the prophet says, oh, you want a king, huh? Well, all the trees decided they wanted a king. So they asked the olive tree if he'd be willing to be the king. He says, why would I want to give up my oil? And they asked this tree. Then finally they asked the buckthorn. And the buck said, I'll be happy to rule over the trees. And so he says, okay, you get a king, he'll make your children run before his chariot, and that sort of thing. And I don't know if you've ever wondered this, but if you remember, there's an episode in the Old Testament Where for something we would consider harmless, the person is punished. And that's, remember, when David, he wanted to take a census. Because it suggests that how many people I have give me the power, not God. And in Israel, remember, there were three authorities, not just the king, but there was the priest and the prophet, all of whom come together in Christ. And you too, as you know, when you were baptized, you received an indelible mark. And that indelible mark made you a priest, prophet, and king. You show that priesthood by your worship of Mass. You show your prophecy by your telling the truth. And you show your kingship by the fact that, as one of the pagan philosophers said, that man is most powerful who's able to rule himself. You know, we try to rule everybody else, but this is the place that we really have difficulty with. But this is the preparation now, because it only restrains the hand, but not the heart. And the preparation is fulfilled in the New Testament. Remember, in the Old Testament, I talked about this is some of the Masses. Moses ascends the mountain and he receives the commandments on tablets of stone as a revelation. And then, of course, I'm always amused by the fact that when he establishes the people of God of Israel, they're right at the bottom of the mountain disobeying the first and most important commandment by worshiping idols. Well, in the New Testament, Jesus also ascends a mount. Only he doesn't receive tablets of stone. He, as the primary lawgiver, sits in a position of authority where the teacher sits. In medieval universities, the professor, they talk about getting the chair now in universities. The professor used to sit in the chair, and the name of the chair was the cathedra. And so the bishop's chair, of course, is a cathedra also, because it represents his authority. And a cathedral is not always a big, beautiful church. It can be any church where the bishop's chair sits and from which he exercises authority. But he speaks the words of the New Testament, and he strikes them at the heart in the Beatitudes. Now, does he deny the commandments? Do not think I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. He says, you have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. But then what does he say? But I say to you, and he was angry with his brother. He goes right to the interior intention. You've heard it said, you should not commit adultery. But I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman with lust in his heart, which means to make her an object of use for his own pleasure, and by implication the man can do the same thing, he has already committed adultery with her in his heart. In other words, he strikes right at the heart. Also, you might ask, well, why are there so many precepts, commandments in the Old Testament, but not in the New? According to the rabbi's enumeration, I think there were 613 precepts in the Old Law. Remember, Jesus was asked to pick the most important of the commandments, the 613. And he pretty much picked what many of the rabbis would have talked about, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the addition from the book of Leviticus, I think it is, love your neighbor as yourself, that's something that wasn't so common that Jesus adds also. But in the New Testament, there are very few commandments. We often talk about, the church, it has so many rules. Well, like I say, go to Israel sometime and see how many rules they've got. Lots. And rules about rules, and fighting about interpretation of rules. How far can you walk on the Sabbath? 1 mile or 2 miles without violating the Sabbath rest. That sort of thing. Now, we have very few. All of our commandments have to do with either receiving grace or living grace. So, the sacraments, for example, are commanded in the New Testament, And they replaced the first table of the law in the Old Testament. But remember, the rituals of the Old Testament were very, very detailed, and they, I don't know what you think about this, but supposedly the more conservative Orthodox Jews in Israel now are bringing the red heifer to start having animal sacrifices again. I mean, in this day and age, killing calves and bulls and making that a sign of your worship of the living God, it doesn't make any sense now. It made sense in those days, but it doesn't make any sense now. Because as we're constantly told, our sacrifice is a contrite spirit. One of the Psalms says, a humble, contrite heart you will not spurn. So the sacraments of the place where we experience this, also we have very few commandments concerning morals. Now we've had to get a little more detailed in some, because especially attacks on the family and on the right to life have become so numerous. It seems every time you solve one, then they bring one on another. And so, especially in medical ethics. You know, the being against family, and especially against children, is not something that began in this century. It began with the French Revolution. And it's interesting to see some more modern representatives of it. On YouTube, you can find a bunch of clips from Pathé News, which is the news division of the British Broadcasting Company. And they put these up to represent some various, important events in the 20th century, now past quite a while. One of them is a clip of Margaret Sanger, the founders of Planned Parenthood, who visited England as soon as the Second World War was over. And she had just made the statement that the solution to the socioeconomic problems in Britain and Europe in general after the Second World War was no one should have any children for 10 years. And the interviewer says, well, don't you think this is a rather radical solution? And she says, no, it's the only way. And he says, well, what about people who'll be paying on childbearing years then? Not be able to have any children. And then she says, well, that's their problem. And then, I had to laugh at this. Then the interviewer got a little exasperated. He said, but childbearing in this country is the only thing at the moment that isn't taxed and regulated by the government. And you want to do away with it? And so she looks right into the camera and she says, well, I guess everybody has to make up their own decision on this. But as for me, I will tell you, no more babies. No more babies. Well, I mean, they just killed millions of people in a war. And she doesn't want any more babies? I mean, why on earth do we exist? When I was a boy, I studied the Baltimore Catechism. I don't know if maybe you did that too. But you know, the second question in the Baltimore Catechism was, why did God make me? And the answer was, God made me to show forth his goodness and to make me happy with him in heaven. But of course, that just wasn't just for me. I mean, the family structure itself is ordered toward making people happy in heaven, and that's why you have children, and that's why you educate them in the faith. And God wants the people heaven with as many people as possible. And we're denying a whole part of that. Many people today, well, I don't have time for children. Or first I had to get my second house and take my vacation to Europe and all this stuff. Well, what's more important than the formation of a human being? A child, even if you don't have a family, people think being a coach is a great thing because what they're doing is forming human beings, like forming men or forming women to be more men or women, I guess unless you have transsexuals on your team today. But that's the whole purpose, is to help a person become more mature as a thinking being that knows how to work with others, what we would call team, being on the team. But no, we can't do that. So in the New Testament, Christ, through his grace, gives us the ability to do this, and also to fight our tendencies toward our own egotism that wars against us living the divine life, which is also expressed in the Old Testament. That's why you'll have St. Paul say, you remember the famous text, the purpose of the New Testament is charity. All extremes are to be avoided except the extreme of charity. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries, but have not charity, and if I have faith to remove mountains, but have not charity, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver my body to be burned, but have not charity, I gain nothing. Sometimes I ask Catholics, what's the principle of merit in Catholicism? And most people will say, whether it's hard or not. The little flower has the answer. At the end of our lives, we'll be judged on love. It's not the greatness of the work that makes it of value. It's how much love with which it's done. So the law is an extremely important thing. And the fact that we sort of dispense with objective law in our society is one of the reasons why we're suffering a crisis in humanity. And the very, and I don't mean to harp just on abortion, but it's the first place where this destruction of humanity occurs. Because if you don't have a right to life objectively, then you don't have a right to anything else objectively. And people can use you as they please. It's important then, we'll talk about this next time, to realize, as our catechism tells us, the goal of the virtues, which the commandments seek to preserve in us, is to become like God. And then we have many psalms, many, many, many psalms, in which under one guise or another, the word law is mentioned because the Jews were so reverential of the law. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The command of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is holy, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. For coming. I hope you come back. And I'll be out there just to say goodbye for a minute or two, and then in the confessional.